one impression that people can get about Samson, both from the biblical account and from the opera itself, is that he is a slow learner. In the opera, we know that Delilah tries 3 times to finagle the secret of his strength out of him, and each time what he tells her is false. She attempts to use that information, and it doesn't work. And one would think that Samson would get a clue at this point that Delilah is really out to trick him. But he is so overpowered by her incredible seductiveness that he really can't resist. And that is one of the fascinating things about this character, his destruction brought about by his inability to resist this temptation. What we know about Samson historically comes from the book of Judges in the Bible, telling this story about the period of the early days of the Israelites before the time of King Solomon and King David, so probably somewhere around the period, let's say 1200 to 1000 BC, somewhere in there. And their conflict between the Hebrew people and the Philistines. That term, of course, Philistines, is linguistically related to Palestinians. So it's that same part of the world. In fact, the opera takes place in Gaza, which is an area of the world that's familiar to us from the headlines nowadays. Interestingly, the character of Samson, as the Bible describes him, is not all that admirable in many respects, and there are parts of his story that we don't explore in the opera. Obviously, there isn't time to tell all of it anyway, but there are some familiar aspects that people know about. There is the famous story of Samson wrestling and killing a lion with his bare hands. There is the story of him slaying 1,000 men with using the jawbone from a donkey. And there are other stories that we don't think about too much, but there is an account of his having fallen in love with a Philistine woman, marrying her. He tells a riddle at the wedding feast that has to do with this lion that he killed. And he promises he'll buy 30 of Delilah's groomsmen fancy new outfits if they can answer the riddle. And in a kind of a forecast of what's going to happen with Delilah, the groomsmen force Samson's bride to weasel out of him the answer to this riddle. And so Samson obviously has a weakness when it comes to women trying to get information out of him. And he's so furious when this riddle is answered that he goes off and kills 30 other guys and steals their clothes in order to pay off the debt from the riddle. So this doesn't cast too nice a light on Samson. Something terrible happens to Samson's bride then in retribution for that. So there's a lot of kind of very unpleasantness going on in the story of Samson before we get to his encounter with Delilah. I think what is admirable in the character of Samson, both as the Bible tells the story and also as he's depicted in the opera, is that his tremendous strength is something that is used to bring about victory for his people, and he is very concentrated on ending oppression by the Philistines over the Hebrew people, and he fights for them and really leads them to freedom. Unfortunately for him, he meets his downfall at the hands of Delilah because of his weakness in being unable to resist her. And his ultimate victory results in his own death. And in a way, it's a kind of a retribution for him, a little bit of I guess, redemption, you could say, for his having failed in yielding to Delilah. In the history of opera, it wasn't always typical for biblical stories to be presented on stage. In some cases, religious authorities or censors forbade that and made it difficult for composers to touch on biblical subjects. But in this case, the composer, Camille Saint-Saëns, decided that this was a very interesting subject to take up. I should mention, by the way, the composer's name is pronounced Saint-Saëns, and if you say the character's name in French, it's Samson. So you'll have to listen carefully if people are talking about these French words. It's Samson and Delilah, Samson and Delilah, and Saint-Saëns is the composer's name. In any case, what the intention was on Saint-Saëns' part at the first was to write an oratorio, that is to say, a sacred kind of symphony, well, as we would think of if, for those of us who know Handel's Messiah, something that was not meant to be staged and would be performed as a kind of a concert religious drama. But it wasn't long before he changed his mind and decided that this would really become a great opera. It had lots of great dramatic scenes that could be really effective in being staged. But we do see at the very beginning of the opera, especially the telltale signs, that writing for an oratorio-style piece was part of the composer's original plan. The chorus is very important at the beginning of the opera. We have very expressive scenes of the Hebrew people expressing their grief, their distress, praying to God for deliverance, and their tremendous frustration that no help is in sight. And then the table is turned when Samson appears, and with his incredible strength and vitality and his zeal, he awakens a kind of a new excitement in them, and they summon the courage to resist, to revolt, and to find victory. And all of this is expressed with choral music that's very exciting and very much in the tradition of the great oratorios. It is interesting to note that the composer chose a mezzo-soprano to be his Delilah, and I don't think that's too surprising, really, because I think the rich, warm sound of the mezzo-soprano voice is often associated with the kind of seductress in music, able to entice men with the sheer gorgeousness and the smooth, wonderful richness of their vocal sound. For someone who's new to opera, Samson and Delilah has a great many interesting highlights that are worth attention and I think are interesting for a newcomer to pay attention to. For example, we have a great deal of dance. This is a French opera from the 19th century when the use of ballet was very frequent. And we have a very exciting bacchanal in the last act where the kind of a, how would I say, a kind of an orgy goes on in the temple as the Philistines celebrate their victory over Samson. We also have battle scenes. We have the tremendous drama of Samson losing his hair and his eyesight, of course, once he's conquered and the secret of his strength is known. And then at the very end, we have, of course, the exciting climax as Samson summons his strength and pushes on those pillars and brings down the temple, killing all the Philistines and himself. Our composer, Camille Saint-Saëns, left us only 5 seconds to depict that collapse of the temple. I'm not going to tell you how it happens, but it's definitely worth seeing. Sometimes in French opera, people will comment that they find it too saccharine, too sugary, too sweetly sentimental. That is certainly not the case with Samson and Delilah. And one of the things I like about it is how the composer so skillfully plays with our emotions. We get tremendously excited in Act 1 with the victory of the Hebrew people over the Philistines. In Act 2, we're tempted along with Samson by the irresistible allure of Delilah. In Act 3, we sympathize so much with Samson's tremendous downfall and the tremendous disgrace, as well as the physical pain that he's having to suffer. There's a little boy who leads him to the center of the temple. Again, a pathetic figure Samson is at this point, mocked and ridiculed by all the people around him. And then, of course, there's the exhilaration of the last seconds of the opera and the collapse of the temple in this very scene right out of the movies. There's a lot to be excited about in this opera.